1. So for those who are in European time, we're very happy to be back with this engaged audience to join us for our 5th session of the CEPR Meeting Plurality webinar series. Unfortunately, Professor Angelucci will not be able to join us today, so I'll be hosting our session. Very happy to be doing that. As you know, the series is a key initiative of the CEPR RPN that you're all members of, and we aim to foster dialogue and collaboration on the pressing challenges of media influence and its implication for democracy. Today, we're very privileged to host Professor Charles Angelucci, the class of 1957 career development professor at MIT Sloan School of Management. So Charles has an extraordinary academic record with research that spans political economy, IO, and the intricate dynamics of news media and voting behavior. He's the author of groundbreaking studies in the field of media economics that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And in today's talk, we are privileged to hear him discussing his new working paper with Andrea Pratt about beliefs about political news in the run-up to an election. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we start. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can always raise your hand and we'll let you speak, or you can also just make a question in the chat. And after Charles' presentation, we will also have a Q&A session if you have questions that you think are longer and that need more time for him to answer. So don't hesitate to make questions in the chat during the presentation and also raise your hand. And with further ado, please join me in welcoming Charles Angelucci. Charles, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. Thank you very much for inviting me to present my work. Thank you also for a way too generous introduction. So as Felipe said, please interrupt me whenever you wish. As I am presenting, I actually would prefer to do that rather than me presenting for an hour and then taking questions. So let's make this a conversation, which I think would be more fun. All right. So I'm very happy to present this work about how people process political information as we get close to election day. This is joint work with Michel Gutmann, who actually is no longer at MIT. He's starting his PhD at Northwestern, and Andrea Pratt of Columbia University. So there are, as I'm sure everyone here is well aware, kind of two big narratives that are surrounding kind of the news environment at the moment. First one is that, misinformation defined broadly is a huge problem. In fact, recently Davos said that climate change and misinformation were the biggest risks that mankind was facing. The second narrative that we commonly hear is that people live in different information universes along, depending on their partisan preferences. So this is a quotation from Barack Obama from a few years ago, where he said, the biggest challenge that we have to our democracy is is the degree to which we don't share a common baseline of facts. So he was not talking necessarily about news, just facts more generally. And he adds, we're operating in completely different information universes. If you watch Fox News, you're living on a different planet compared to if you're listening to NPR. Simon Rosenberg, who is a Democratic Party strategist, he was interviewed on the Ezra Klein podcast, and he said something very similar. He said, the challenge now is that there isn't a single information environment in the US. There are at least two and maybe even more. And I should add that Ezra Klein actually disagreed with this claim, and his response was that the biggest division was probably not information universes along partisan lines, but the fact that there was a good chunk of people who care a lot about politics who are well informed, and there's an equally good chunk of people who are probably disengaged with politics and as a result are not that well informed. So in what follows, I'm gonna refer to the first hypothesis, the fake news one, as the death of truth. We are overwhelmed with fake news, and we are completely unable to distinguish what's true from what's false as a result of that. And the second hypothesis, I will refer to it as the parallel information universes, the fact that we believe different things depending on our own partisan preferences. The first hypothesis, to the best of my knowledge, has received little support in recent academic research. Of course, we have to be cautious when we make these claims, but if you look at the papers that have been published on this topic, they tend to go against a too negative take on the depth of truth hypothesis. So there's this survey of the literature in the end 2021, where he writes that claims that we live in a post-truth society are not empirically supported and should not be used to support interventions that threaten democratic values. In their landmark paper about the 2016 US presidential election, Alcott and Janskow estimated that the average American saw maybe one piece of fake news or maybe a couple in the months surrounding the election, which is a much lower number compared to the real news that the same people were exposed to. And and I'm listing additional papers, including a previous paper of mine with Andrea, where we come to a similar conclusion. In particular, in our paper with Andrea, what we say is that people seem to be pretty good. The average person seems to be pretty good at discerning a true political news from a fake political news. Now, when it comes to the parallel information universes hypothesis, there I think it's fair to say that the evidence is a lot more scattered. So there are papers like the same paper I was mentioning earlier by Alcott and Chanskow that conclude that people are much more likely to believe stories that favor their preferred candidate. And there are other papers, and I could be citing many more, that kind of come to different conclusions. So in my own work with Andrea, kind of one of the punchline from our paper was that partisan congruence, meaning the extent to which I believe things that are congruent with my pre-existing political preferences is important. It's a thing, but if you quantify it, it's much less. It seems to be much less important compared to, for instance, socioeconomic characteristics. So, for instance, my gender, my age, my income has a much bigger predictive effect on what I believe compared to my partisan preferences. In this paper, we're going to try and reconcile these diverse sets of evidence on the parallel information universes hypothesis. And again, please feel free to interrupt me with any questions you might have. So we're going to be using data from a large political news knowledge survey that we conducted a few days before the 2020 US election. So not the 2024 US election, but the 2021. So just to give you a few details to help you fix ideas, we basically design a survey and a quiz in that survey where people had to distinguish true news from fake news. And the true news were selected as the most important true news from the previous 3 years. So you should think of our presidential news quiz as a retrospective news quiz. And we're going to be combining this data from the data we used in our earlier paper, where we were also running monthly surveys with news quizzes in them, but the news quizzes were, for the most part, about very recent news, right? So in December 2018 news quiz, you would have stories from November 2018. And this is in contrast to the presidential news quiz, where some of the news stories in there were up to 3 years old. We're going to have a common methodology across both types of news quizzes. Every time these news quizzes will be administered to a representative sample of US adults, which we recruited through YouGov. The news quizzes were incentivized. I'll come back to that. This is important. So people had monetary stakes when completing these quizzes. And we collaborated with a jury of journalists to select the news and the true and the fake news stories that were included in the quizzes. Let me show you kind of the raw evidence that motivated this project. Each news story in our quizzes has a political, we give it like, we call it a partisan score. So if a story has a positive partisan score, it means that it reflects positively on the Republican Party and negatively on the Democratic Party. And conversely, if a news story has a negative score, it means the opposite. It means it reflects favorably on the Democrats and unfavorably on the Republicans. And I'll come back later. I'll show you exactly how we compute these scores. Here, what I'm showing you is the average favorability of the news stories that people select when completing our quizzes And presumably, if they select these news stories, is because they think they are the most likely to be true. What this is, and I'm distinguishing between all the quizzes that were outside of the election period, which I will define later. So this includes quizzes that were taken before the election and after the election. And here I am showing you the average partisan score of the news stories that people selected when completing the presidential news quiz. And I'm differentiating between, of course, Democrats, independents, and Republicans. So outside of election, what you see is that people tend to select news stories that are congruent with their preferred party, meaning there's a tendency to choose stories that reflect positively on their preferred party as the most likely stories to be true. So not surprisingly, this gap is positive. Now, what's striking is that when it comes to kind of very similar news quiz, but taken during an election, the gap between Democrats and Republicans more than doubles. Okay. So this is suggestive, for now it's only suggestive, of an effect of elections on beliefs in the truth or falsehood of news stories. Of course, this is not, we should be cautious before drawing any conclusion, because there might be a lot of differences between these news quizzes. For instance, the presidential news quiz was a retroactive quiz. So it included stories that, for the most part, were pretty old compared to the other quizzes. So maybe there is something along the lines of, if news stories are old, people forget about these news stories, so they have to rely, so they're not as accurate when assessing the truth of the stories. They have to rely on their partisan prior, and that mechanically could explain part of our results. Similarly, it could be that just by chance or lack of chance, the news stories that were included in the presidential news quiz were just very difficult to distinguish as true or false. That could happen. And lastly, of course, and probably the biggest concern, not concern, but just feature, is that maybe the stories that journalists select near an election are just much more polarizing stories. That would make sense. More salient, more polarizing stories. So if the news quiz includes stories that are more polarizing, again, mechanically, people will be left with no choice but to select very polarizing stories. So in order to disentangle all of these kind of confounding factors, one needs a model, and that will spend probably 10 minutes of this presentation showing you the model that we use. Just highlighting, previewing our results, what we'll find is that the model actually confirms the raw data. So when distinguishing between true and false news stories, individuals are more likely to identify the truth when it favors their party, and this effect, this partisan congruence effect, is much bigger as we approach election day. So what does that mean for the motivation I gave you earlier? It means that when we're thinking about the parallel information universes hypothesis, kind of suggests a dynamic, we should somehow adopt a dynamic perspective on the formation of parallel information universes. Outside of elections, people seem to be decent, and I will show you, decently good at distinguishing true from false stories, and they are impacted by their partisan preferences, but not in a way that's too large. But the same people, as we approach the election, the reverse seems to be true. We become political animals, and we become much more biased in our processing of political information. This is consistent, maybe, with a motivated reasoning framework. As a reminder, in the motivated reasoning framework, people are kind of torn between two objectives. On the one hand, they have instrumental value of holding accurate information. So that would be an optimistic take, would be to say that near elections, people have greater instrumental value of holding political information. And the value of holding accurate information is traded off with the psychological cost that we have to incur when we hold beliefs that are incongruent with our partisan identity. So people are torn between these two objectives. What our results seem to suggest, if we adopt this framework, is that the salience of partisan identity increases vastly during election and overshadows any increase in instrumental value of having accurate information. All right. Maybe let me stop a second, see if there are questions. Okay. So let me tell you about the method, and again, please interrupt me whenever you have any questions. Okay, so everything I will show you today relies on survey data, which we have gathered in partnership with YouGov. YouGov is a polling company, which I'm sure most of you know. YouGov already collects a lot of basic information about respondents, so we know all the obvious things that you're thinking about: their age, their income, their party identification, their education, etc. In addition, we've designed our surveys so that we ask them questions about their recent consumption of national news, and more importantly, we inserted news quizzes in these surveys where people had to separate true stories from false stories. Today, I'm not going to show you much about dynamics in consumption of news. I will focus mostly on the news quizzes themselves. We've been running this survey repeatedly for the past 6 years now. And every time we administered the surveys to a representative sample of US citizens age 18 or more. Today, I'm going to show you, in fact, today I'm going to use all the information we have. We use data from 12 surveys from December 2018 to March 2022. And the presidential survey that I mentioned earlier. In total, you should think of this as a repeated cross-section. In total, we have 10,000 unique respondents. And most of this data comes from this earlier paper, but not all of it. So our objective is to kind of come up with a measure of how discerning people are when distinguishing between true and false stories. So of course, the first challenge that we were facing is how do we select which true stories and which false stories? So one way, there are many ways one could approach this problem. The way that we adopted, which was practical for a number of reasons, and also we feel natural, was to collaborate with actual journalists, mainstream journalists. So we have this jury of multiple journalists, which each week read wire stories from the Associated Press and Reuters, and they send us their selection of the most important news stories in that week. And I should say, sorry, that the focus was on US national politics. Then I will skip the details. We have ways, of course, 2 articles could actually be dealing with the same underlying story. So we also use a journalist to kind of deal with this challenge. And then we aggregate their weekly selection at the monthly level, and we arrive at a ranking of the most important stories of the month in US national politics. So I think there's a question in the Q&A. The answer is yes, and I will show you. So indeed, we see dynamics. So before the election, people seem to be quite discerning. During the election, the gap grows and then it shrinks back. Unfortunately, we don't have as many surveys after the election as we do before the election, but the effect is there. So this is an example of a true news stories that our journalist would select. Biden nominates Jackson, first Black woman to the Supreme Court. Most true news stories will look like that. So it's written in a journalistic style. It will tend to cover important events, objectively important events from our point of view. And we have a lot of variation. In our news quizzes, survey respondents must distinguish between true and false headlines, and we've decided to incentivize these news quizzes. So there was a bit of a trade-off here, so that's kind of a comment on method. In some sense, whatever you do, comes at a cost. If you don't incentivize accuracy, then it is known from the existing literature that people will exhibit what is called like a cheerleading effect. So they're just going to say, oh, it's just like because of expressive utility gains, basically, I'm going to choose stories that reflect positively on my preferred party just because there are no stakes in this quiz. So to avoid this, we decided to incentivize these quizzes, in particular, if if our survey respondents completed the quizzes well, they would receive $1, which 4 years ago was a decent amount of money for a quiz that would take only 60 seconds. Now the drawback, so that's what we went for, and I think we made the right decision. Of course, the drawback is that in the real world, people are not paid to hold accurate beliefs. So you should think of our approach as having some sort of upper bound on how accurate people can be. In the previous slide, I told you how we selected the true stories. The quizzes contain both true and false stories, so we also had to select false stories, and the selection of false stories matters because people will have to choose between true and false. So even though for the true stories, I think we came up with a very natural, non-controversial criterion to select true stories, like the most important true stories according to mainstream media by professional journalists. When it comes to fake news, we couldn't possibly think of a symmetric criterion. What does it mean for a fake news to be important? How do we even have access to the universe of fake news? So this is a tricky problem. So the way we went was to basically go for robustness. So what we basically adopted two methods. The first method is what everyone in the literature, I believe, is doing. So basically, we work with fact-checking organizations, and we ask them to send us the fake news that they think, still about U.S. national politics, that they think have been circulating the most. So that would be an example. And we work with Snopes for the most part. That would be an example of what we call a real fake news, in the sense that it actually circulated online. So former President Donald Trump's Truth Social platform will cost users $5 a week, and that was not true. It was free. So this is an example of a fake news that's, let's say, pretty reasonable. In reality, my understanding is that most political fake news that are fact-checked by organizations like Snopes are pretty different in style compared to the real news. Most of them are borderline satirical. Often they have slanderous content, and also just basically often trivial assertions, where even if the fake news was true, it probably wouldn't be so much of a big deal. So we were a little worried about this asymmetry between the true news and the fake news. So what we did, and in fact, this was our preferred method, we asked our jury of journalists to come up with what we call synthetic fake news, or placebo fake news. These are fake news that actually never circulated. They just came out of the imagination of our journalists. So what we asked them, we didn't give them too many directions. We asked them to write false headlines of things that definitely didn't happen about the US national politics in the same style as the real headlines that we also asked them to write. So that would be an example of a synthetic fake news. Biden signed bill to mandate climate change curriculum in all K-8 classrooms, which he never did. Let me give you a preview of the quiz. So if you participate in one of our surveys, at some point we tell you, okay, well, on the next page, we will ask you to read 6 statements, 6 headlines about recent events related to the federal government. And we tell them that exactly 3 are true and 3 are false. And moreover, if you happen to successfully select the true statements, then we will give you $1. And we give them 60 seconds to answer this quiz. That was not an obvious decision either, but of course we were worried that if we didn't put a cap, then people would just look up the answers online. So we had to, there was a trade-off there. So we went for 60 seconds, which we felt would give most people enough time, and at the same time would make it tricky to Google the headlines and check whether they were true or false. And then we tell them that it's in their best interest to select exactly 3 statements. That's what a quiz looks like. We put a timer there to help people, to remind them that they only have 60 seconds. And maybe you can take a second to read some of these headlines. So basically what a survey participant is doing is they're reading all 6 statements, and then the mental exercise that they're going through is to basically rank them by their plausibility. They have to rank, and they have to pick the 3 stories that they feel are the most likely to be true, and they have to select these 3 stories if they want to get the dollar. After the, again, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. After the quizzes are over, and once the participants have been told which stories were actually true and which stories were actually false, we also ask them to basically tell us how each story reflected on the Republican Party and on the Democratic Party. And this is the partisan score that I was mentioning in my second slide. So we're going to be using how people feel each of these stories reflect on both parties to construct the favorability of these headlines to the two parties. We can use this information in many ways, and our results are very robust to all the ways we can construct partisan scores. We asked, and I should add that we asked this question both for the true news and for the fake news. I don't have an example for the fake news, so that's a little tricky. But for the fake news, we say something like, imagine that this story had been true. Would you say it would have reflected positively or negatively on for instance, on the Republican Party? This was a description of the monthly news quizzes. So these are these monthly quizzes we've been running, where the news stories that are included in the quizzes, both true and false, are supposed to cover events that are less than 4 weeks old. But as I mentioned, in the context of the 2020 presidential election, we decided to run a special quiz, a retroactive one. So we essentially ask our journalists, the same journalists, to look back at all the stories that they had been selecting since the beginning of our collaboration, meaning December 2018, and to choose the most important true stories from this pool of true stories. And then we also ask them to select or produce 4 synthetic fake news and 4 Snopes fake news that cover the same event. And long story short, we had like 4 variants of these election quizzes to have more stories that we could rely on in our analysis. The survey was administered to 1,600 individuals, really just a few days before election day. Right? Election day was like November 5th, I think. And I should add that, and this is going to become convenient, this will turn out to be convenient later. In addition to this, special presidential election news, we actually also ran a regular monthly news quiz embedded in the same survey. So again, by construction, a lot of these headlines will be about the election simply because we are a few days before the election, but they're not old. They're less than 4 weeks old. Okay, that's what the presidential news quiz looks like. There are 8 stories this time, so we give you 80 seconds. And again, we tell you 4 are true, 4 are false, and you have to select the 4 that you think are the most likely to be true. Maybe I will leave the list up for a second so you can read some of these headlines. Okay. If there are no questions, I will move on. So this is a slide that I prepared to kind of summarize what I call the architecture of our data. So these are the 12 monthly news quizzes that we ran and that we use in this paper. The first one was in December 2018, and the last one was in March 2022. So each of these rectangles means that we ran a news quiz where people had to select between true and false headlines, all of which were less than 4 weeks old. In addition to this, on 2 occasions, we inserted old news quizzes in more recent surveys, meaning that in November 2019, we had not only the regular November 2019 news stories quiz On top of that, we also basically repeated the quiz from the previous month. Okay, and we did the same in February 2020. We also inserted the news quiz from November 2019. This is something we did because we were interested in measuring information decay. So as news stories get older, does it become harder? Intuition suggested it should. Does it become harder for people to distinguish between what's true and what's false? And the number 6 here indicates that it was exactly the same 6 news stories that were repeated 1 month apart. And then on top of that, the last bit is the presidential election news quiz, which we ran, of course, in October 2020, which drew questions from previous news quizzes. Right? So for instance, one story from December 2018 was selected as a very important news story that should definitely be included in the presidential election news quiz 2 years later. All right. Now I'm going to move on to the model, which has a lot of parameters floating around, so that could take a few minutes. So if you have questions on the survey design, now would be a good moment before we move on to the model.
Charles, I actually have a question about the survey design. Like
Yes.
when in the quizzes that you ran, like do you have any questions where you use images as well? Because I'm also wondering what is the role of images as well in this in distinguishing.
No, that's a good question. We didn't. Everything is text based. But there is some research in political science that suggests that different socioeconomic groups have different I don't know, like attitudes towards writing versus visual cues. And it is definitely possible that by using just written headlines, we are tilting our results a little bit. I think you raise a good point. It would be interesting to have some sort of robustness check at some point where somehow we change the design of the quiz and we have not only headlines but also pictures that go with the headlines, which after all is what the world looks like. So that's a good point. Thank you. Okay, so our objective is twofold. It's to measure how discerning people are in distinguishing between true and false news stories, and given the motivation of the paper, it's also to measure the extent to which people engage in what we call partisan congruence, meaning a tendency to believe that something is true just because it reflects positively on your preferred party, and irrespective of whether it is actually true. So we have we microfound a model with the following thought experiment. We think there is an individual I. So let's begin, let's do it like step by step. Suppose we give individual I a statement J, headline J. And what this individual will do is form a posterior belief that that statement J is true, which we call tau J equal to 1. So tau J equal to 0, meaning it's false. So this belief, which we denote Q, will depend on the characteristics of individual I, for instance, her age, on the characteristics of the headline. Is this a very plausible headline, for instance? On the age of the headline, as in, the headline covers event. When did these events happen? Was it less than 4 weeks old, or is it 3 months old, etc.? And then we're also going to allow the beliefs that this individual hold about statement J to be different depending on whether we are near election day versus not near election day. This is what E stands for. So let me give you our parameterization. We actually work with the log likelihood ratio of these beliefs, which is just a monotonic transformation. and we give it the following functional form. So let me, for now, just interpret the first term, and then I'll move on to the second and to the third terms. First term has three components: theta I, gamma j, and delta t. You should think of theta I as how discerning individual I is. For simplicity, think of everyone as having a positive theta. So 0 means that you're not discerning at all, but positive theta means that all else equal, you're more likely to hold accurate beliefs compared to inaccurate beliefs. If your theta was negative, that would mean that you're an individual who has a tendency to systematically get it wrong. Whatever is true, you think is false, and whatever is false, you think is true. For now, let's rule that out. Suppose that individual I is a discerning individual. Theta is multiplied by gamma j. Gamma j is how plausible statement J is. Again, just to fix ideas, so one way to think about this is to say that true stories have positive gammas and false stories have negative gammas. So if you ignore delta for a second, that means that if individual I is a discerning individual, if statement J, then her beliefs about statement J will be shifted to the right if statement J happens to be true, and it will be shifted to the left if statement J happens to be false. The magnitude of gamma also matters tremendously. If story J is true, then the more positive, the larger gamma J is, the more individualized beliefs about the truth of statement J will be shifted to the right. And conversely, if gamma J is very negative, that means that this false story is really easy to identify as a false story. In our estimation, we will be treating both theta and gamma as unobserved. So these are parameters that we will have to recover. And the idea, kind of the philosophical idea here, is that it's very hard for the researcher to know the difficulty of or the plausibility of the headlines that we actually insert in our quiz. And therefore, that's something that that should be part of the estimation. Delta is the effect of time passing, which we call time decay. Our conjecture is that delta should be smaller than 1. It will be. This means that the older statement J is, the less discerning individual I will be about the truth or falsehood of that statement. If a story is very, very old, I'm just basically unable to rely on any accurate information to determine whether it's true or false. Let me know if there are questions on this first term. In this paper, this is an important parameter because the presidential quiz will have stories that are sometimes 3 years old. And so we should definitely take the effect of time passing into account. The second component is what we call partisan congruence. At the moment, let me ignore parameter R, and I'll come back to that later. Bj is captures whether story J reflects positively or negatively on the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And it's something we treat as observable because we use the other questions that I showed you, where we ask people how they feel about the reflection of these news stories on both parties. Pi is the party identification of individual I. In our main specification, it takes 3 values. Either you identify as a Democrat, as an independent, or as a Republican. So suppose that you are a Republican, Pi takes value 1. Suppose that story J reflects positively on the Republican Party. Ignore R. Suppose alpha is positive, then that means that it's like something that shifts your beliefs in the truth of statement J, irrespective of whether statement J is actually true. And the larger Bj is, that is the more favorable this story is to the Republican Party, the more your beliefs are shifted to the right. The parameter alpha captures the strength of this effect. And it's one of the parameters of most interest in this particular paper. So it's what we call the strength of the partisan congruence effect. We conjecture that it will be positive, and the larger this alpha is, the more you are an individual who tends to believe stories that reflect positively on your preferred party, irrespective of whether they are true. In an extension, we allow this term to also be multiplied by RT, which is basically we allow for the effect of time passing to also matter through this channel. As it turns out, at least in our data, this plays very little role. So I'm not going to show you any results based on this. The last bit of notation, just 1 second on this, is lambda I. Lambda I captures how skeptical or gullible individual I is towards any news. There's no J index here. So that's like, you know, I'm an individual who tends to find things true. Like whatever you show me, I will have a tendency to think it's true. Or the opposite. I'm a very skeptical individual. I don't believe mainstream news at all. As you will see in a few seconds, this lambda I will actually drop out, and we will not be able to recover this parameter. Okay, almost done with the model part. Let's take our little model one step closer to the actual quizzes that people have to complete. Suppose that we give this same individual I a set of statements, capital J. And we ask this individual to tell us which statement amongst the set of statements we gave her she finds to be the most likely to be true. You know, under the right assumption on the error term, you get the usual logit specification. So if you've worked with these models before, this is all this should be all very straightforward. If you have not, let me just point out two things, which is that the levels of the plausibility of the, you know, this gamma J, which are the plausibility parameters of the statement J, the levels we will not be able to recover, because in this probability function, the only thing that matters is the difference in plausibility, which is kind of intuitive. An individual I will find the only thing that matters in determining whether individual I chooses one story versus another is how much more plausible this story is compared to the other. So that's why we cannot recover the absolute level of plausibility of the stories, but we can recover the difference in plausibility of the stories. The same is true for the BJ parameter. So we observed that, so this is not a question of identification, but the only thing that matters in partisan congruence is how much more favorable a story is compared to another in determining whether I find the first statement more plausible. Again, let me stop here for a second and see if there are questions on this. Okay. Remember that in the quiz, we actually tell you, here are 6 statements, 3 are true and 3 are false. So in reality, we don't ask you to select one statement, but 3. But rather trivially, you can use this probability you know, to compute the probability that a given individual select any bundle of 3 statements. And we estimate the model by simulated maximum likelihood. Okay, so now let me get to the part of the presentation where I show you some results. Oh, actually, sorry, forget. Intuition for the identification of the various parameters. I'll go quickly on this because I suspect not everyone is fascinated by this, but this is all very intuitive, actually. So we have to recover. We're interested in recovering the gamma J parameters. As I already mentioned, we cannot actually recover the levels of gamma J, but we can recover the differences between the gamma J parameters of any two stories, J and J prime. The variation we use to recover the relative plausibility of the stories is very intuitive. You know, in any quiz, think of it this way. It's a little bit more complicated, but just to fix ideas, take a quiz. In that quiz, take a new story, doesn't matter which one, normalize its plausibility to some arbitrary value, say 1. Then the remaining 5 gamma J parameters will be identified by the share of people who select these 5 stories as the most likely to be true relative to the normalized statement. So suppose that we picked a true story as the normalized statement. And now let's look at a false story. If relative to the true story, the false story is selected by virtually no one, the model will basically accommodate this by saying that the gamma j of the false story must be very negative, because that's the only way to accommodate these differences in probabilities of selection. How do we recover individual discernment? So first of all, we give it this functional form. So individual I, basically we assume that any individual who belongs to the same socioeconomic group has a discernment that's drawn from the same, from distribution that has the same mean. And we give it this functional form. So basically, individual I's discernment will depend on various pre-selected respondent characteristics. In line with our previous paper, we assume that these characteristics are gender, age, the obvious ones, gender, age, income, education, ethnicity, and party identification. And let me skip some of these details. I have 2 more things to say on theta. One is the way that we identify the various beta parameters is, again, I think quite intuitive. If one socioeconomic, if one characteristic, for instance, if one characteristic is predictive of people selecting correctly the true stories, then the beta will move to accommodate for that. And conversely, if a characteristic is predictive of people getting it wrong, then beta will also move and probably take a negative value. The assumption that we make is that theta is time invariant within our study. So, which intuitively should be something you should question, because it amounts to saying that how discerning people are is time invariant. There's no seasonality. It doesn't depend on whether there is an election or not, which of course goes against intuition, because you'd think, for instance, that during elections, people might be paying more attention to the news. That turns out not to be a concern, because any aggregate movement in how discerning people are about the news will be picked up by our gamma parameters that I showed you in the previous slide. If, for instance, in 1 month, the average person is paying a lot of attention to the news for whatever reason, that just means that our quiz will happen to be easier, okay? And so the gammas will move to accommodate this feature by being more dispersed. So long story short, we do take into account movements in how people are discerning, which may depend on various types of aggregate shocks, but we load that variation onto the gamma parameter, not on the theta parameters. Very quickly, let me check how I'm doing on time. We recover the delta parameter by looking at these pairs of repeated stories that made it in multiple quizzes over time. Okay, so if we see that people struggle when determining whether stories are true or false as these stories get old, then this is something we'll recover through delta. And then the alpha parameter, that's basically the difference in alpha. Alpha, if you remember, is the strength of the congruence effect. We're gonna pick up any difference in partisan congruence simply by looking at, given all the other parameters that we have estimated, is it the case that people exhibit a greater or smaller tendency to select partisan congruent stories during elections versus outside of elections? All right, now I have 10 minutes on results, which I think is perfect. These are the estimates that these are the estimates for our parameters. If you stare at them, you can actually learn already quite a bit, but they're not very easy to interpret. So I'm just going to skip this table and present you our results in a way that's much more intuitive. This is the main table, and if I cover this in detail and the next figure, then I think we can even call it a day. So here, I'm going to use the estimates from our model to imagine a very simple counterfactual. And I'm going to vary this counterfactual to convey to assess the strength of various channels. Let's look at the baseline column first. In the baseline column, I'm considering an average partisan individual, either somebody who identifies with the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And I'm giving this average partisan person a typical pair of true and false statements. And by typical, I mean that we can use basically the distribution of gamma J parameters that we have recovered in our estimation procedure. So I'm giving this typical individual, a typical pair of true and false stories. And I'm telling this individual, look, one of them is true, one of them is false. Select the one that you think is most likely to be true. What I am doing as we move across rows is that I am varying how much more favorable or unfavorable the true story is compared to the fake story. So first, if it happens to be the case that both stories reflect in the same way on the preferred party of this individual, then this average individual has an 80% probability of getting the quiz right. And this goes back to my depth of truth hypothesis motivation. 80% is pretty far from 50%. So in that sense, it's good news against the depth of truth hypothesis. And this is in line with our earlier paper. Suppose now that I make the true story much more favorable to this person's preferred party, then this individual, oh, sorry, I forgot to say, big sorry here. Baseline, I mean, outside of an election period, and both news stories are less than 4 weeks old. Okay, so think of this as the baseline. If I make the true story favorable, increasingly favorable to this individual's preferred party, then the probability that she selects the true story goes up. Okay. Conversely, if I make the true story unfavorable to this individual's preferred party, then the probability of selection goes down. If you look at the extremes, so same quiz, just varying how favorable the true story is to this individual's preferred party. If I make the story very favorable versus very unfavorable to this individual's preferred party, then this probability that this individual will complete the quiz correctly moves by 7 percentage points, which is kind of similar to the same order of magnitude as what you would get. This is from our previous paper, if you varied the socioeconomic characteristics of this individual. So for instance, if you make this individual above the age of 52 as opposed to below, then you increase the probability that this individual selects the true story by 6 percentage points. So what I'm saying is that outside of an election, as we move away from election day, the effect of partisan congruence on the ability to complete the quiz is of the similar magnitude as the effect of socioeconomic characteristics such as age, gender, ethnicity, etc. Suppose now that I take exactly the same hypothetical scenario, except that I make both stories old. Say, I'm being a little vague here, but suppose older than 4 weeks old. Not surprisingly, the probability reduces universal, across all scenarios, the probability of this individual uniformly across rows. So if you make the story is older, the quiz becomes harder for individuals, so it's less likely that they complete it correctly. Now, the one thing I want to highlight is there is this mechanical logic in the model, which is that if you make the stories older, you're basically deflating the first term in the equation I showed you a few slides ago. You're basically loading more onto the partisan congruence effect. So basically, in the Bayesian framework, if my information is less accurate, I am going to rely on my prior more. But the point is that this seems to have only a negligible effect on the extent to which people select stories that reflect positively on their preferred party. So to put it more plainly, in other words, the fact that the retrospective survey had all stories in it explains part of the reason why this gap goes up in the raw picture I showed you, but it seems to be a relatively modest impact. Let me skip to the fourth column in the interest of time. So now I am again making both stories less than 4 weeks old, but now I'm supposing that this individual is completing the same quiz, but 2 days before election day. Of course, if partisan congruence doesn't matter because both stories actually reflect in the same way on his preferred party, then that doesn't matter, 0.8, 0.8. But at the tails, it seems that during election day, whether the true story reflects much more favorably or unfavorably relative to the false news has a huge impact on people's ability to select, to complete the quiz successfully. And in fact, the partisan gap more than doubles, and it goes to 17 percentage points, meaning during an election, if I give you a typical news quiz, but it's so whether the true story reflects very favorably versus very unfavorably on your preferred party has a 17 percentage point impact on your probability that you select the true story, which is of course, much higher than 7. I'm almost done. Let me just show you kind of the time. So this is related to the question I got in the Q&A. Here I am plotting the alpha parameter, which is the strength of the partisan congruence effect, for each quiz separately. So these are all the quizzes that we administered before the election. These are the 2 quizzes, I'll explain this in a second, that we administered during the election. And then these are the 2 quizzes that we administered after the election. Unfortunately, we don't have nearly as much data to the right as we do to the left. But, oh, and I should say that, of course, if we estimate the model on each quiz separately, the estimates are going to be a lot more noisy because, of course, each sample is going to be a lot smaller. But when you look at this kind of time series data, what you see is that there seems to be something going on during the election. The alpha parameters that we estimate are much higher than even the highest alpha parameters that we estimate outside of the election period. One last word on this. We obtain very similar results, even if we drop the presidential news quiz entirely. Because as I mentioned earlier, we actually did run the usual monthly news quiz, even in our presidential election survey. So even if we get rid of this red thing, even for the regular newses that were less than 4 weeks old, people, because we are during an election, it seems, behave in a much more partisan way when processing information. Let me kind of conclude here. We think that these findings are consistent with a motivated reasoning framework. In particular, the model seems to connect very nicely with this very nice paper by Andrew Little in 2019. So it's not so much that people hold motivated beliefs that they care per se about the news, but they have this partisan identity and they need to protect this partisan identity. And this is going to distort the way they process auxiliary information like news. Okay. There is, of course, already a literature, big literature, that shows that partisan identity matters in determining the way people process information. Our contribution is to show a dynamic story, that the extent to which it matters depends on the electoral cycle itself. Also it would seem. And a story that seems to make sense in our setting is that basically elections heighten partisan identity. Yeah. This is in line with literature outside of the news kind of media strand of the literature that finds that elections, for instance, amplify effective polarization. Okay. There's another paper that came out recently in the European Economic Review that showed that even non-elected US judges whose partisanship we know make judicial decisions that are much more partisan if we are near an election as opposed to outside of an election. Okay, So in conclusion, outside of elections, the extent to which voters live in parallel information universes seems somewhat limited, but the opposite is true during elections. As you approach election day, which news stories people find more plausible is largely, a much larger part, determined by their preferred party. And we think this effect is consistent with a motivated beliefs framework due to an increased salience of partisan identity near election day. And I believe I am done.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Charles. This is very striking results. Very good. So now I would open the floor to our participants. If anyone has any questions, please raise your hand, and Charles will be happy to take them. I have a question. I mean, you have observed these effects for 2020 US presidential elections, but like imagine that you have this data spanning several years, like historically. Would you say that this partisan congruence effect that you found like during elections, how would you say that it has moved? Like, would you say that it has become more pronounced recently?
I don't have any data to answer your question, but I can say two things. One is that there's a lot of papers being written on polarization these days, of course, and everything points towards suggesting that we live in a more polarized world. That could be speeches people make in Congress, that could be effective polarization, that could be. I have another paper on US state legislatures that show that they're becoming increasingly polarized. I would be surprised if this is not true also in this context. And the other thing I want to say is that we collected data also as part of the more recent election. So maybe one day, not not to replicate this result, but we have the data. So we could look into whether the same thing happened in the more recent election. And my guess is probably. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, well, that's very good. So if anyone, yeah, wants to make any question, otherwise, I would just like thank you again, Charles, for being with us today. Like, thanks for sharing your insights and for being here. And before we wrap up, I just wanted to remind everyone that our upcoming events of the Media Plurality webinar series is on the 9th of December at 5 p.m. with Ariana Ornagi from Hertie. And we will also have another one with Sophia Hate from INS Leon on the 13th of February, 2025. So stay tuned in your emails for more details, and we hope to see you there. And thank you once again, and have a great end of the day for all of you.
Thank you. I see that there is a question in the Q&A, but
Okay. Yeah, I guess we can maybe perfect. So Camille, do you want to take this, Charles?
yeah, of course. So thank you, Camille, for the question. Yeah, so I didn't have time to show you this also because it's not really the object of the paper per se. But the interesting thing is that it seems that every socioeconomic group becomes much more partisan during elections. If I understood your some groups more than others. I think the group that becomes the most partisan in their processing of information during election are white men. Okay, which people tell me is not surprising, but and other characteristics are less. I mean, everybody becomes more partisan across any socioeconomic characteristic, but some more than others. And the ones that be increase the least, even though everybody increases, just by eyeballing, it makes sense because these are socioeconomic characteristics of people that are less engaged with politics to begin with. Okay. So I think, for instance, if you're non-white, you become more partisan, but much less so compared to if you're white. And but we know from other works that being a minority tends to be unfortunately correlated with being less engaged with politics.
All right, I guess, yeah. So do we have any more questions?
Well, if there are no questions, if anyone wants to reach out by email to talk about this project
Yeah.
or anything related to this project, I would be very happy.
I guess there's one last question, Charles. So Leo, maybe I missed it, but do you distinguish between motivated reasoning and confirmation bias?
We cannot, unfortunately. So that's a good point. In the paper, we discussed that, the literature has basically mentioned many channels through which politics could affect the way that people reason about information. Our model is quite flexible if you remember the specification, but it's not specific, it's not flexible to the extent that we can even distinguish between the competing frameworks that are out there. We emphasize motivated reasoning, but maybe it's a little inaccurate then. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.